What? No, that also. I get it. You guys need the folding table. The folding table. Yeah. Okay, so if not, maybe I'll leave you keep my part.
Okay. I hope we're live. So first of all, it's nice to be back to giving Shiurim. It's been a while. The first week of Kolel, my thought was to give a share on something relating to Eruvin, something we're learning now. But in the end, I found myself otherwise occupied that Thursday. Had a daughter, B'Shara Teva Mitzlachas, Baruch Hashem. And last week also, a bit preoccupied, distracted. It's a little hard to focus on in Yom like Eruvin. And then Thursday specifically, I ended up having to go somewhere. But so the one topic that I was thinking about, though, over the last week or two, is in the context of this happy occasion. And of course, as everyone knows, that doesn't matter whether it's a boy or a girl, as long as it's healthy, right? But Lamaisa, personally for me, it was first daughter after a number of boys. And so kommt doch heute Pashat Lomdish gerät, that noch bekeim gewinnt the mitzvah von Peri Verivia. Größte Simcha. Right? Even Begashmias, even without the mitzvah, there's usually a shtickle simcha, and after you have a series of one, you finally balance out a little bit with the other boy or a girl. Stam Rosh, the Gashmias is in the Shtalshel from the Ruchnias. But a kapanim, here's a Torah dika vart, something that surfaces, you think of it, comes to mind in this type of context, in this type of situation. And in fact, even when I was talking to different members of the family, also it's something that tends to come up. Girl, whatever. I was thinking about it a little bit. And it's already a number of days past, a week or two since the birth. There's no bris milah. At a bris, you get to give a drasha. But the drasha is still got to give it somewhere. So, and b'noisef lekach, a number of people have been magder that sometimes the shiurim given in this misgaras tend to relate to things that are minyana d'yoma. Now, I have no idea if anything else happened in the last 2 weeks. Wasn't following the news, but this is the news. This is the news that I'm aware of in the Kolel. This is the latest news. So, it's minyana d'yoma. Now, it's not just, all jokes aside, it's not just Nageya to me personally. You're the whole Yungalite. Just married, maybe you have maybe you have a child or two, Shal Teva Mitzlachas. But to a great extent, as Yungalite, you're all in the sugya. This is the sugya you're in right now. The sugya of Peri Verivia. However, my impression at least is that with all the chassan classes that are multiplying by the day, and with all the shiurim you even had in Kolel, it seems like the tendency is to focus on other aspects relating to marriage, to intimacy, etc., etc. Of course, if, heaven forbid, someone has a difficulty with children, so then the focus might shift to that, at least in a practical way, to give aid, assistance, support. But it seems to me, it feels like the actual halachic concept, the dinei pru don't necessarily get a practical emphasis, even though we call it a mitzvah rabba. It has that name in a number of places, including in Hilchos Talmud Torah of the Alter Rebbe, in Perek Gimel Halacha Aleph. Alter Rebbe says, you shouldn't marry until you learn Torah Shebal Peh Kula first. Alter Rebbe defines what that means exactly, and then Alter Rebbe says, "V'lachei nidches b'pnei limud zeh mitzvah rabba shel Peri Verivia af shehi gedolah mikol ha-mitzvahs." So the context there happens to be that he's emphasizing the other thing. He's emphasizing learning the Torah, but along the way he emphasizes the chashivas of Pirvarivya, and that only something like learning Torah, which is, we suppose, the equivalent of whatever we're supposed to be doing in yeshiva, is. So that delays, that outweighs the mitzvah rabbah Pirvarivya temporarily. And then you move along. We know, of course, there's also the famous Vart, Chabad, that Pirvarivya is the Ershta mitzvah in the Torah. And of course, there's much more on the topic in Chassidus and in Sichos. But at any rate, my point is that seemingly this is something that maybe deserves a bit more focus and emphasis. I would add and point out that it's not just Beruchnius on the books, but if you think about it, this mitzvah is essentially the one mitzvah that one's entire Yiddish life, the entire Jewish life cycle is essentially built around it. Because everything revolves around the concept that one ought to get married at the first opportunity, however you define when that is. But that's generally the attitude. You're trying to get married at the first appropriate opportunity, whatever that is for you, and to have children and to raise a family. And in the absence of that, without that, it's almost impossible to really feel like a member of the community, Adam and Hayishuv. I'm not here to use labels and make statements. This is generally the attitude one picks up on from society. To the extent that there are some who argue that maybe it's a little too far and it's not sensitive to those for whatever reason, find themselves unable to make that step, and we have to be more tolerant, to be more accepting, and have more space in society for those that are single, etc. That's not the focus here right now. I'm not here to hurt anyone's feelings, but it still seems a fairly true statement that without taking that step, without moving on, so there really isn't much of a presence and a future for a person in the community without all of that. And befrat in the so-called black hat, Haredi community, right? So until marriage, you're essentially, you're like a child. You haven't set out into the world. And then as soon as you seem mature enough to be shaykh to anything, so step one is you get married right away, you start having children, and then life begins within this misgaret. Once I'm already making this point, I'll make another point in passing, make an observation that we see in Chabad, in our community, in the last couple of decades, that feels like for a large percentage of any given grade, yeshiva tends to end somewhere around age 20. And then there's, for like I said, whatever the percentage is a certain number that it's almost like you're free to spend the time as you wish. So l'chayra, this phenomenon is not just broadly against these values, broadly in violation of these values that we have, and what is more in line with secular values in the world around us, where marriage and children of course, has a totally different significance and context and what life is about. Obviously, within a certain range of however they view marriage and children. But so, in addition to saying that it's against our values, quote unquote, but we're mentioning the mitzvah. We're talking about the halachas. So l'chayra, that's pashut, essentially hapech dinei HaTorah. We just saw from the Alter Rebbe that really a person reaches puberty, 18, 20, max, person's chayiv in period v'rivya, and the only exception is if a person's ibegegeben, dedicated to learning Torah Shebal Peh, which like we said is generally however it is equivalent to whatever we're learning in yeshiva. So then we're being doich and nidches mipnei limud zeh, special exceptions being made. But the concept of leaving yeshiva and just killing time, spending time, has no basis in halacha according to all of this. Now, mele, if the person's spending the time actually building a career, really focusing seriously on work, and I would say it's not our particular derech, but maybe maybe it is angenommen elsewhere, and maybe you could find makaitis for that idea of you're working towards marriage. You just want to feel like you're financially stable, you have a financial future. But the concept of yeshiva essentially ends automatically, and lavdafka, you feel the pressure to look for something serious. This is the opportunity to dreze charom and check out the world. So nothing to do with preparing for marriage. So that would be problematic. I'm not here, as usual, telling anybody what to do or telling the community what to do, but just to point this out, to define, be magdir, what the mitzvah is, what the halacha is, because sometimes some changes happen gradually, you don't pay attention as they're happening. And I'm not saying that there weren't other points in history, different times, different places, where also maybe people tended to get married later, and although that itself is maybe where I'm heading somewhere along the way and what I want to discuss. But it's just important that you want to define, have an accurate definition and description of what's going on, and if we're dropping our old values and adopting new ones, so we should at least be aware of that and not deny the reality, the changes that are occurring. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, so we have a very important central mitzvah here. Like I said, in a certain sense, it's defined all of your lives to a great degree. That's why you're here, in a sense. And yeah, we heard a lot of discussion, a lot of focus on what are the halachas of perividivya, how does it work? The way you'd expect, considering it's important, my impression is not. So this is the topic I want to get into a bit. And I really want to discuss, what's the vart, what's the hagdara, what's the nekuda of mitzvahs perividivya, the halachas. And I want to discuss that while focusing on some of the halachic discussions, lamdisha discussions that come along the way that relate to that. Some of them may be slightly more well-known to you or to some of you. And I'll just point out that in preparing the makaitis for this discussion, so I relied in great measure on a sefer called Ishu Beisai, a whole monograph. Someone already wrote a whole sefer on Hilchas Perividivya. Someone wrote the book on the topic. And there's a lot of good material there. Pnim, ha'aris, the standard halachic format that's popular today. But as you'll see, the presentation here is my own. So this is how I would jump into the topic. This is how I would begin. If you think about it, there are a lot of shvera nekudas, or at least nekudas that are not so understandable, not so obvious on first thought on this whole topic of perividivya. Right, so first let's start by pointing out that really this is a mitzvah that has a number of components that stretch out over a period of time, right? Step one is you have to get married. Step two is be'ila, you're trying to have a child. That's a maisa. Then three, you have to have, the halacha is you have to have 2 children, not one, and number 4, hagufa has to be a zachar nekeva la'alacha. So, with that in mind, we can ask a number of questions, a number of very general questions. Number 1, what is the ikar, chelik of this mitzvah? What is the main component, what's the main aspect of the mitzvah? And what is tafel, what is just a prat in the mitzvah? Right, you could say this is the mitzvah, that's haksha mitzvah, or that's the shiur mitzvah. This is a din in that, that's a din in this. What's the ikar here? What comes along with it? That's one question. Number 2, similar, related. If you look at the person being mekayim the mitzvah over a period of time, at which point in time during that stretch would you say is the main point when you say, now yatz tatzich the mitzvah ifkatan? Meaning, even if you say that it's as late as you have to wait till you actually have the children, then you're mekayim the mitzvah, if you say that's the ikar. But even then you could ask, is the ikar the moment they're born? Or are we still waiting around, and are they going to grow up? Are they going to get married? Are they going to have children? How far, how deep are we looking to see whether this mitzvah is mekoyim? Or somewhere in the middle. They have to grow up, but maybe not. We don't have to wait till they have somewhere. When do we say, now story's over, and mitzvah, we're finished? And finally, maybe the main question to me is, what is b'chlal the whole point of this mitzvah? What is the mitzvah here to accomplish? Because l'chayra, I would say it's a starker question, at least to me, that the whole yesod of the whole mitzvah is a bissel shver. Of course, we know that more or less it's biologically imprinted within living things, living beings in nature. That nature, you have males, you have females, the males and females procreate together, they have offspring, pretty basic stuff. Across the entire nature, not just the min hachai, but today where science explains it, even min hatzemeach, as musig of zocher and nekeva to some extent, etc. And we can look around, and generally speaking, historically, even today, plenty of people, it's not a very difficult, it tends to happen on its own for many people. Unless you go out of your way to prevent it from happening. But otherwise, leaving human beings to their own devices and letting nature to take its course, males, females tend to procreate and have children.
Can we say that it's there to balance the condition too, maybe?
Okay, so that's something I'm not even going to get to today, but yeah, that is a potential theme and factor, which I do want to get to at some point. Yeah. But if you're focusing on having offspring, but pashtus, it's basically something that should be happening on its own. Of course, there are differences in different cultures, and particularly nowadays with the culture today and the attitudes today, and I want to get to that at some point. But otherwise, people, humans, just like everyone else, just like all the other species, procreate naturally. So, what exactly was the mitzvah coming to say? By definition, every mitzvah kommt on something. You have to say the mitzvah is coming to make sure that we do this, and the outcome is that. So I would say al derech hatzachos that the way this mitzvah sounds right now is a bit as if like the Torah would come and say that it's a mitzvah saying the Torah to be alive. Zos leben. Mitzvah say number one, by the way, before you do anything else, you should be alive. Right? What would that mean? It would mean you have to eat and you have to live, and the shiur is maybe 70 years. We could make a whole mitzvah, a lot of pratim out of it. Right? But isn't it pretty obvious that most people tend to live and tend to eat and tend to live out their years, and that's the norm, that's the definition, that's what all living things do, huh? I'm going to get to that in a second. So, that's a leisa say. It's not an asay. There's no mitzvah say to live.
Many people today they don't have necessarily 2 kids.
Okay, we're getting to all of that. We're building. We have to start with the yesod, and we'll get all the other ideas along the way. So, isn't it psadavar pasha? Everyone understands that it's nature, biology. We live. We don't need a command to live. There might be a few people that might go off track and have their own strange ideas, and maybe we need to make sure that they don't make that mistake. So if the Torah determines that it's enough of a concern that it needs to be addressed, so there should be a leisasa to bavar in these types of mistakes. So that would be the leisasa says lamashal lagabe. If you say nishmar moed, whether it's a leisasa or not, I don't have the mar mekaymes offhand, but to the extent that it's necessary to intervene and tell you that on Shabbos you're supposed to be Mechal Shabbos, wherever it's necessary to clarify some things, so the Torah clarifies, but the Torah doesn't have to tell us the basics. And that would lead us into the discussion of the definition of mitzvah say versus leisa say in general, but without looking into it, l'chayra pasha to me that every mitzvah say is trying to accomplish something that the person wouldn't otherwise do. There's a large chance that without the mitzvah say, a person wouldn't do it, and that's why you need a mitzvah say telling you to please get up and do X, Y, and Z. You think about all the mitzvahs, most of them certainly are not things that we would be doing stam. And
it's a mishpah. Say it's a mishpah. It does make sense.
What makes sense?
The mitzvah anyway. Leisix don't make sense.
Okay, I'm talking about mitzvah say specifically. Mitzvah say the Torah is telling you to go do something. Pashtos, it's something you wouldn't normally do. You don't need to be told to do extremely basic things. You need to be told to do things that aren't basic, that aren't obvious. So that's my assumption with that. So we don't need a mitzvah say to be alive, because it's pretty basic, pretty obvious. So before we get to the pratim of Pirivadivya, I would personally like to understand what's the whole mitzvah, what's the concept of the mitzvah. Now, if you would ask me slightly more than 2 weeks ago, meaning right before I started looking into it a bit more, thinking about it a bit more, without any extra thought, if you ask me what's Pirivadivya, what's the word Pirivadivya? So I think I would have likely said that it sounds to me like the definition is it's about populating the world. Yishuv ha'olam. Here's by the means of this mitzvah, Hashem is letting us know that populating the world, keeping the world populated, is a specific aim, a specific objective that we should put our minds to. Meaning, it's true that people, even unthinkingly probably will have children, but the Rebbe is coming and saying that, by the way, it's a very important, Torah places an emphasis on the population, keeping the population going. And so for that reason, the Torah is coming and telling you that this is something just to keep your eye on. Whatever, maybe you're doing everything you need to do already, but this is just something to keep in mind. That's what I would have thought. I think also that might be informed by different things that Rebbe said generally on these types of topics. That seems to be the sense you get from the Rebbe, that that's a very important value. Although, even if you were to say that, the question I would have then is the point here to increase the population? Are we trying to grow the population long term? Or is the main point here that we're just trying to sustain the population? We're just trying to maybe keep the numbers in place, but we're just making sure that the human population doesn't drop off. So you're just trying to replace yourselves. So now let's come back around a bit to the halachas. So, of course, the halacha is 2 children, Zachar and Nekeva, which the father and mother are Zachar and Nekeva, and they're having their children are meant to be, ought to be Zachar and Nekeva. Right, so let's take a look a little bit at the Makaitis that establish this point. Right, so Mishnah Yevamah says, you shouldn't stop. So we'll get to these terminologies, I guess, in the Hamshech, how the words peri v'rivya are used in sentences. But lo yevatel adam mi peri v'rivya elam ken yesh le banim. What are banim? B'shamay say shnei scharim. B'sil lo yim zacher nekeva. The halach is like B'sil, the Rif, the Rambam, the Smag, Paskin like B'sil. So it sounds like zacher nekeva dafka, and the whole word of B'sil is to tell you that 2 scharim would not be good enough. And you see this in a number of other Rishonim. There's also Pirush HaMishnayis LaRambam, where the Rambam says clearly, Av HaMitzvahi b'Zachar Nekeva shebehem Yiskayim Hamin. In order for the population, so we'll see this term in the Rambam in different places, Yiskayim Hamin. So in order for population to be sustained, you need to have both males and females. So male and female should ideally replace themselves with a male and a female. And you see this in the Zohar as well. Oiled Ben Ubas. Why are we emphasizing all these Makaitis? Because it's interesting to note that in the Yerushalmi, as we have it, the Yerushalmi says, there's a daya, or the way the Yerushalmi refers to it is, that afilu zachar nekeva. The B'sil are coming to say, afilu zachar nekeva. And the Mefarshim and the Yerushalmi say that Lafi Zeh, that the Yerushalmi is saying, that when B'sil said zachar nekeva, all he meant to say was even zachar nekeva, meaning you would think for sure shnei scharim, because I guess scharim is the ikar. But kun B'sil zag, you know what? We'll give it to you. You have a zachar nekeva, so ichkut. Totally different perspective on what we're talking about here. And there's even an Ashba, there's an Ashba somewhere in a tshuva that casually says afilu zachar nekeva, which is interesting. But Lamaisi, you open a Shulchan Aruch, Ibn Ezer, Siman Aleph, Sif Hey, Kivin Sheish La'adam, Zachar Nekeva, Kiyam Mitzvahs Peri V'Rivya. Sivav, person has Zachar Nekeva, they passed away, but they themselves had children first, so they left children behind. Kiyam Mitzvahs Peri V'Rivya. But Medvarim Hamurim, when the Bnei Banim are Zachar Nekeva, and they come from the Zachar Nekeva, all the Pratei Halachas that we may or may not get to. So pretty clear from the way the halacha werd abgebracht in Shulchan Aruch that we're taking Zachar and Nekeva very literally, and in every prat, in every iteration, whether it's even the grandchildren, it's always the Zachar and Nekeva, the Zachar and Nekeva. And it says it's right. So pretty clear that a person only had Zachar, only had Nekevas. So halacha we're saying, I'm a kind of spirit of Redivya. To Radbaz, just for the sake of illustrating how these halachas are applied, let's take a look at the tshuva of the Radbaz. So Radbaz was asked, this is Radbaz Chelik Aleph Sim Kuf Chavav, the Radbaz was asked that someone, the context here is polygamy. All right, so and, the Radbaz lives in Egypt in the mid to late 1400s, and apparently they're still practicing polygamy, they're still practicing marrying multiple wives. We know, of course, the Ashkenazim had Chem ben Gershon. And even the Sfardim, if you look in, I believe, of Bar Shalom, in one of the krachim of his set, he goes through how a large number of Sephardi countries, Dafka had a Tanai in the Ksuba, Lamaisa, that the Baal is being mischayev, that he's not going to marry another woman. And he goes through the geography, which countries had this, and it may have been spread by the exiles from Spain. They may have spread this to a number of additional countries, and which countries were practicing polygamy mamish up until 100, 150 years ago. But if you just assume that it's Ashkenazim versus Sephardim, it's not quite that binary. But from this tshuva that Radbaz, it seems pretty clear that in Egypt, at least at that time, I think there's something upset the kind of the Rambam. Here it sounds like we're talking about milieu, a context in which marrying another wife would have been acceptable. However, it was also ungenommen to swear, to give a shvuah to the wife made a tanai, that the lemaisa, you shouldn't marry anyone else. So this person swore to his wife that he won't marry anyone else, but they included in the clause that if 10 years pass and she doesn't have children, so then he'll be patur from the shvuah and he can marry another wife. Lamaisa, she had a child during this time, of Vlad Shel Kayoma, but ultimately the child died. And then another 10 years elapsed after that. And she didn't have another child. So is he patur or not? Patur from the shvuah, patur from the chiyuv, can he marry or not? What's the story? So he says, you're asking about the child dying, so mashma, that's pasha to you, that if the child was still alive, that certainly he wouldn't be able to marry anyone else. And it's not so true, not so simple. Some say even if the child was alive, he would still be patur from the shvuah, because another 10 years, right, she'd give birth, he wouldn't die, 10 years would pass, she didn't have any other children, so she's not getting any closer to Pir V'Rivya, so the same 10-year concept, 10 years of not having children, not getting to Pir V'Rivya have elapsed. So he says it's the machlekes rishonim. Some say if you're not Mekayim Pir V'Rivya, so the 10-year thing is the same musik. And the Rashba says that no, once, the whole 10-year concept, if she has one child, then already we're not kaifa l'haitzi or kaifa to marry someone else. But he's maida that if the child dies and then 10 years pass, then everyone agrees that kaifa l'haitzi or to marry someone else. He adds, you also have the Chem de Ben Gershom, Oisam shekiblu aleim Chem de Ben Gershom, that he argues is that even those who accept the Chem de Ben Gershom, if you wait 10 years and you don't have a child, or the child died and you wait 10 years, so even the Ashkenazim would be allowed to marry a second wife, according to the Radbaz. So Radbaz's point is that, look, Mekayim Pir V'Rivya, and they're alive, so certainly he has a shvuah, even if there's no Cherem D'Meinu Gershom. What about having more children? Isn't there an Indian of having more children? That's only Midrabanan, the shvuah, Deiraisa, she can use the shvuah against him that he won't have more children, he's just Mekayim Pir Revu, and that's it. But Pir Revu itself, which is a mitzvah Deiraisa, so if she gave birth and they died and 10 years passed, so the Kuli Alma, he'd be allowed to marry another one. If she had one, that's the machlekes of those Rishonim. And he personally is being noted towards the Rishonim that say that you would be allowed to marry another wife because Seif Kol Seif, Pruruvu. He says, for this reason, there's a Mukha Yosef that says that if she had multiple children, kulam scharim, kulam nekevis, so even though the mitzvah is achar nekevis, there was no chen devin gershom, no shavua, nothing. If she had multiple children, but they're all scharim, they're all nekevis, and the Mukha Yosef said that ein kaifen eisel lo heitzi. Sagt Rabbi, so versteh nicht. Prurevu, the 10 years is to get you to Prurevu. You had many children, and then as long as she's having children, you can keep on hoping at the next one. She has a bunch of children, she stops having children, 10 years pass, you see you're not getting to Prurevu, there's no reason to assume she'll have children now. You're in exactly the same place as the one who didn't have any children at all. You both were Mekayim Prurevu equally. It doesn't matter if you have 10 boys in your house. And that's the context in which he says that Afilu yiyu elef banim ubanas, 1,000 sons or 1,000 daughters, like him, it's a pretty pashudu. So he leans very much in that direction. That's just the context to see. You could see how the Rabbi was applying these pratim and these mitzvah halachas in his time. Fine, the bottom line is that the mainstream psak is zachar nekeva. Fine, okay. So that being the case, so it sounds like, what's the idea? If we focus on that the idea taka sounds like, the father and mother should replace themselves and themselves alone, just have another male and female. Like we mentioned, there's this other chiyuv of having more children. We can discuss that separately. What's the makar, what's the gather? But right here, we're just focusing on the ikar mitzvah of Prurevu, which we said is just a zachar nekeva. I was actually thinking about the significance, the context, the word of population, right? In terms of, if you actually think about it as a practical matter, if our goal, our thought is we're concerned about the size of the population, the mitzvah plays a role in that. So let's think a little bit about world population, Jewish population. Right? So we take it for granted right now that every year the world population grows by a large amount. Just on the way here, I looked it up. Where's the world population holding now? I was surprised. It was further than I was. 7.97 billion is where we're up to now, and they're saying we're going to hit 8 billion by November. So we're at the cusp of 8 billion. 7 billion was just a couple of years ago. But actually, the truth is that if you look at history long term, it feels like the world population actually remained pretty much the same for most of recorded history. So if you start from the beginning of Bayis Sheni, so 500 BCE, until the year 1500, so about 2,000 years, there are different estimates. Obviously, we don't have hard numbers, but the estimates that we have today are that the world population was somewhere between 100 million and 500 million throughout that entire time. So for 2,000 years, we were nowhere near a billion. 1500, the year 1500, you could say, maybe slightly before, that's when it starts growing steadily. Until either by the 1700s or 1800s, we got to our first billion in recorded history, as far as we know. Then it took till 1920 to get to the second billion. 1960, 3 billion, 1975, 4 billion, 1987, 5 billion, 1999, 6 billion, 2012, 7 billion, now we're about to hit 8. So things have accelerated tremendously just in the very last short period of time. You can say, half jokingly, that for those who are committed environmentalists, so they would probably view the human species right now as what we call an invasive species, because like the lanternflies, you see them, you're supposed to kill them. They're getting out of proportion, right? There's a whole ecosystem, and the humans are one part of it, and now human growth has run away. But that's obviously not what we're talking about. Although obviously we can have a separate discussion as to what Torah thinks about that. But the point is that for hundreds or thousands of years, it looks like the human population didn't move too much. And it could be that it was pretty much a given, actually, that the given population, a country, it was pretty much a given that the numbers should remain fairly much in place. Why would that be the case? That would have been due to the conditions of the world. There would be famine. Periodically, there were wars, diseases, child mortality. And of course, there are all kinds of explanations as to what suddenly changed a few hundred years ago, what happened then. And if you want to focus specifically on the Jewish population, also an interesting question. So it seems that from after the Churban, before the Churban would be a different question, but from after the Churban by Sheni, the world's Jewish population seems to have been under 1 million for maybe 1,000, 1,500 years, for a very long time. And then in the last few hundred years, that's when the numbers start climbing very, very quickly. And then, of course, to counterbalance that, you have assimilation, you have the Holocaust, etc., etc. And I'm not an expert on all this, so maybe I'm getting something wrong, but that's my impression. So, if one wanted, one could say that Pru Revu in the Torah might just mean that the Torah we start off as a small family, a small shevet, and Pru Revu until you become a large chashuva nation, and then maybe it's expected that at some point the numbers remain fairly static. They grow, they shrink. So Bazai, if one thinks along these lines, then maybe that would fit fairly well with the concept of the Torah saying just a zachar and a keva. The main thing is to keep the numbers static. Whatever is beyond that is nice, but that's a different gather. Like we mentioned, the Rambam has a lashon, kiyum hamin. Kiyum hamin sounds like sustaining the population. And I was actually thinking, once I was thinking along these lines, I was thinking, what about other species? Right, we have some species that we know have hundreds of offspring. There are some, mostly mammals, that are more similar to us in this way, that they have one offspring a year. But of course, they keep on repeating the process every year for a number of years. So it seems like the standard in nature is to have more than two. Two is actually a pretty low number, less than natural. And I actually looked it up. What's the lowest number of offspring that any species has? And it says any species that has less than 10 is already extremely low. And there's some species of fly that has an average of 4.5. That's the record lowest in nature. However, I would also point out that, to talk about the context of nature, of the ecosystem, is the whole ecosystem. Part of the ecosystem is that nature is accounting for famine with other, not just with humans, with the animals. There's going to be bad years, won't be what to eat, there are going to be diseases. The animals, of course, eat each other, so there's a whole system where one species feeds the other. So it could be that, broadly speaking, every species has enough offspring to offset all the other factors that are eating into its population, and ultimately the long-term goal in nature is just to keep the numbers the same. Again, this is my svar, I'm not an expert, I don't know what the official hagdara that's given is. So Bazai, if we're talking about humans also, so Bazai, lavdafka, when we say zachar and nekeva, do we mean that, a person gets married as a zachar and nekeva, okay, you're good to go? Because historically, what were the chances? A person only had a zachar, only had a nekeva. Historically, what were the chances that they would grow up and live to have children and families? All right, someone pointed out to me that today, with today's conditions, we say that in order for the population to be sustained, you need to have an average of 2.1. If the average was 2, then the population would shrink. The average has to be 2.1 in order for the population to be sustained here in the West. And the Maisa, the number right now is below 2. Whatever, that's obviously a different discussion. That's speaking for a group as a whole, for a nation as a whole, based on statistics. So that means that if everyone only had 2, the Torah says have 2, if you took that to mean everyone should have exactly 2, and weiter gefahren, statistically, a certain portion of those people are not going to end up down the line long term with 2 children who will have 2 children, etc., etc., until the numbers will start shrinking. The bottom line will be that the numbers are shrinking. I don't know if there's a number for what number you would have needed in the olden days. What would the number have been then to make sure? I don't know. So whoever only has 2, so hatadin, like someone who had less than 2, because 2 doesn't actually, maybe for you it's going to work out, but if everyone has 2, then everyone didn't have 2, everyone had less than 2. Lamaisa, this seems to fit with what you see in these halachas, that if they're not roi lahoilid, lamashal, if they're not able to have children on their own, you're not mekayim the mitzvah. The Gemara says, if nimtza saris like kiyam perividivya, Because if they can't have their own children, so then they can be Mekayim the Yishuv, the Shabbos Yitzhara, etc., etc. Or if the children die, Rahman al-Atzlan, Gemara says, Hayalei Banim Umesu, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Leiki and Perver Rivya, the Shabbos Yitzhara. Discussions about that, we don't have time to get into all the pratim. Was kommt aus von these Nakodas? L'chayra kommt aus. Now, if someone just gets married and has a Zachar Nekeva, at the moment that they're born, we still have no clue, we're still far from confident that, it's all over, it's all good, we're good to go. That's not what it sounds like. Saying two sounds like we only want two, but from all the other pratim, Ruim Lahaylid, Mesu, sounds like two isn't really good enough. Technically, if a person has two, it sounds like, you can stop being Isaac and pervertive, and sit back and wait to see what happens. Chas v'shalom, statistically, something's going to happen to a certain percentage of people. Then they're going to have to scramble and try to have children again from Abbas Banim. And Al Pisvar would make more sense that one should probably, just to have two, one should probably have a number of children to start out with, so that way you're more sure to have the outcome that you want at the end. Even if you don't want to have multiple children, just for the goal of having two, you would have to have more than two. So just to conclude, if we wanted to address in the interim the different questions we started off with, so if we said that the Iker Teichen mitzvah is to replace the population, to sustain, to have a Zachar Nekeva, to replace a Zachar Nekeva. And we would say that that's Takel Lamdishkaret, that's the Iker Chelik of the mitzvah, and everything else is a Hachana, whatever you want to call it. And when is the Iker Kiyam HaMitzvah? It's Takel L'Cher, not when you have the children. Technically, you're Pater for now, for the meanwhile, but you wouldn't say that you were Mekayim the mitzvah now. It sounds like you're Mekayim the mitzvah sometime deep in the future. So that would be how we would address and answer all those questions lefi this line of thinking. We're going to have to pause. I'll just conclude by saying this is obviously not as pashut as that sounds, and there's a lot more to add, but it's going to have to be next week. I'm hoping Tafka towards the beginning of the week. I'm just letting you know now. Good Shabbos.
You can't say something like Lamafreya kind of thing? Unless that was in another instrument.
What's this Lamafreya?
Like, I'm saying, before all the mitzvah was done,